here to talk to you about specifically what's next for enterprises. I focus on enterprise since sort of early 2000 when I was in France. I was actually running a telematics or IoT firm called Thales Telematics, and ever since I more and less stayed in the world of IoT and cybersecurity. So you will see a lot of signs of cybersecurity here because that's another field that I'm working on. But hopefully, you know, if this would be helpful to you in terms of looking at you know, there has been really too much hype, but also real roadblocks for IoT. Back in 2014, I was in Russia, in Skolkovo. This is just before, or just the time that Ukraine issue happened. So it was one of the last times Americans actually were in Skolkovo giving a speech. And I gave a speech similar to this about IoT and how big it is. And I remember I showed a McKinsey slide which said by 2019, IoT would be at $3 trillion. We all know we're not there whatsoever, and the reasons is because we, you know, have a number of roadblocks. The first one being the cybersecurity issues and concerns. That if you ask CIOs, that would be one of the first things they would tell you. But also immature enablement platforms, a lack of standards and interoperability, difficulties in retrofitting, legacy equipment, especially for logistics, energy, and diverse connectivity protocols, and still too high costs in general for implementation and deployment of IoT. So what are really the reasons is, in other words, there are too many building blocks needed to build an IoT solution, and also too many platforms and too many also use cases. So you can see that, you know, different building blocks, different platforms that one needs, and for enterprises and CIOs and operational heads to think about what are different pieces I need, which ones do I use, how do I integrate all of this together is very complicated. And in terms of use cases, what you see on this graph, you actually see about 30 use cases, which are different segments of IoT, and each of them have a sub-segment. So when we add all of that, we're talking about 100 specialized use cases, and this is, you know, for enterprises. So you can see how complicated is this whole system. And in fact, what we did is, again, back in 2014 that I had given the speech, I used the, you know, the landscape to the left and see how it has exploded just over 3 years, the landscape to the right. This is both comes from the same source, FirstMark, which has first ever came up with these landscapes. So really, IoT is becoming increasingly complex and difficult to manage. So let's look at, you know, what really has happened over the last 2-year performance of IoT sector public companies. Good news is we finally have a bunch of IoT public companies that we didn't have 5 years ago. In fact, they were just like kind of 2 IoT companies which were public. And also, we can divide up our IoT companies to hardware, solution provider, and what you see on this graph, which is a first analysis graph, actually this in 2018, the return on the shares for IoT companies as a whole, all of them, was slightly negative, about 2%, while the year before it was about 25%. That compared to NASDAQ, where the year before, in 2017, the return was about 28%, and in 2018, the return was minus 4%. But if you look, as you can see on the red graph, which is software solutions for IoT, they've done quite well, better than NASDAQ. But then on the hardware side, you would see they have not done so well. But, you know, generally, I think that if in general, as you can see, the whole IoT sector kind of has been a little bit in pause, which is what was related to those roadblocks. We at Aknowledge actually have developed a database of 200 private and public, a lot of them private transactions. And what you see here is transactions which were done in B2B transportation only. It's not exhaustive, but it does show you very interesting graph, which you see that over years, since 2012, if you take complete average, the multiples have increased by 2.5 times. However, if you take the leaders, you would see the multiples have increased from like 4 times revenue to 8 times revenue, even sometimes 10 times revenue. So it really shows you how important and how interesting IoT is, and how companies like to buy these large companies, or transactions are done several times. We have a number of situations in over the last 5 years. The same company has been bought and sold 2-3 times, and each time with a higher multiple. Outside of B2B transportation, actually the sector of IoT, which is demanding the highest multiple, is connected car, autonomous, or enabling technologies like semiconductor. For example, Mobileye was sold for $15 billion, and Intel bought it, and it was at, if I correctly remember, 43 times multiple of revenue, which is pretty crazy. Or you had ThinkWorks, which got bought by PTC for $130 million when it only had $5 million revenue, because ThinkWorks was an enabling platform. So what you see is either very enabling platforms, software platforms, or enabling technologies like Mobileye, like ARM, which got bought as well by SoftBank, are the ones which are really demanding very high multiples. But it is very interesting to see both in terms of level of activity in M&A as well as the multiple increase over time. Now, if we look at what's really happening, IoT Analytics, which is a research firm, has done a very good job to show that the growth rate for IoT has already been double-digit, but it will remain as double-digit. And we need this inflection point. We thought the inflection point is going to be last 2 years, but it hasn't happened. Now, IoT Analytics thinks it will happen in 2020, and the reasons for it would be the removal of those roadblocks that we talked about, in our first slide. Especially costs will come down. There will be interoperability, software platform, and enablements will be possible. So that horizontal sort of building blocks and platforms that I showed the very first slide will be resolved. Now, there are a number of different search firms that actually give different sort of forecasts. We kind of like IoT Analytics. We think there are more reasonable forecasts. Others that, I mentioned the $3 trillion number, do not have that kind of sanity. Just to give you an example, Cisco had said that by 2020 we will have 50 billion IoT devices. This is back in 2014. And today we know that really the number of IoT devices as of 2019 will be somewhere around 13 to 19 billion. And then by 2021 will be around 23 to 25 billion. So you can see that lots of hype has been sort of hurting IoT in some ways. Now, in terms of, to show you what is the revenues looking like. So again, we're using IoT Analytics, which says that the revenues as of 2017 were about 110 billion, and the division is really primarily enterprises, which is what I'm talking about, are driving this revenue, with connected industry being among the top ones, and then smart cities, building and living, and as you can see, healthcare and mobility. But what is connected industries? Basically everything which is industrial, which is asset monitoring, and smart grid, is in the smart cities, but it would be asset monitoring, maintenance, manufacturing, some of the big areas. What's interesting is, regardless of the size, all of the sectors are growing double-digit. And then when you look at sort of geographies, Asia, which accounts for now 38% of all of IoT spending, in North America accounts for just about 30% and Europe about 27%. So majority of really the revenues are happening in these three regions. With Asia, obviously, the big lion's share of spending is happening in China, and in there, primarily you have manufacturing and a smart grid. And then in North America and Europe, you have a little bit much more of different industries. There's still manufacturing and industrials do take an important share of that spending, but you also have transportation, logistics, healthcare. So that sort of shows also the focus of these regions and why certain ones have higher share. So what do enterprises tell us about their IoT experience? What they tell us is that they're starting to understand what to do with IoT. So what you see on this graph on the very top is the very first way for enterprises to enter IoT or to launch IoT is to think about how they can do cost cutting or cost efficiency at the same time that they would provide higher customer services. So this would be like field services can use IoT in a very favorable way. From there, the next step is how to create what we call connected relationship. That means how your product is connected, so when you know you have to maintain it, how do you use that experience and knowing how the customer is using your product in order to do product line management, to design and architect your next product. And then the final one, which is to the right side, is really to find what is the right business model, and should you change your business model from going towards, the nirvana is going to subscription models. Majority of enterprises today are either on the top one or bottom left, and few of them are really doing the right side. And this is what is shown in next two slides. First is when we ask how your firms plan to adopt IoT solutions, you would see that 79 to 90%, depending on which industry is, they say that it is very critical to some of their lines of business. 33% to 54% would say they're very confident that that they are building sufficient digital trust controls into IoT. And then about 24 to 37% say that they will invest in IoT security in the next 12 months, which will bring us back to one of the first roadblocks, which is the cybersecurity. When we ask them that, how are you focusing, where you're focusing actually your IoT spending or deployment, 27% say that into optimizing service operation, which is what we discussed earlier. 16% said optimizing internal business operations, 17% monitoring the company's products to drive sales and services, and then only 16% said developing new IoT products and services. So in other words, enterprises want first to deploy IoT solutions to get their own, if you like, efficiency and better customer service. So which verticals are actionable now? We earlier showed these big graphs and big numbers, but not as specific with the vertical because there's just so many subsegments will be discussed. We believe there are 4 verticals which are very actionable, which being transportation and logistics, automotive, manufacturing, and health, and they're followed by smart grid, retail, and agriculture following. So when we talk about what is actionable, we're talking about the revenue number versus the number of units. Because if you actually look at the number of units deployed, smart grid has a very high number of units, but the dollar value per module and the services that they provide is much smaller than when you do transportation and logistics. So transportation and logistics, while they have a smaller number of units deployed, the amount of revenue they get from services is much higher. Automotive, of course, includes connected cars, but also it includes construction. And then healthcare, these are all actually with the smart grid, all of the areas where they're growing double digit. And we know that from, if you look at the module providers, the companies like Gemalto, where I'm on their board, Telit or Sierra, you will see that these are the sectors where they are growing the most in. So one of the things that's very important is, why we're having maturity in B2B transportation and supply chain IoT. It's because of two things. One is Amazon, and the whole concept of how e-commerce is changing, and we're having these urban logistics distributions where we're going to have warehouses just outside of the urban areas or within the urban areas, like Amazon has big warehouses now within New York City. On one hand, on the other hand is Uber effect, where everyone, enterprises are saying, I want to have the same experience that I do today as a consumer. And that's really driving a lot of maturity. So what's happening in B2B transportation as a case study of how a sector is maturing with IoT? We had one of the earliest companies in B2B transportation as IoT vendor is Omnitrax, a company that I'm on board of. And they were founded in 1988. So we had somewhere from 1988 to 1995, I would say, preparation. And then we had early adoption for about 15 years, then rapid adoption about 6 to 8 years, and then we really are now in process of building the ecosystem. So while in late 90s and 2000, the vendors very specialized. They sold primarily hardware with some services. They serve a specific subsegment. Then in starting 2010, they started serving more of, they would serve long haul, but also local, IoT providers. And it started focusing more on service sales. And then future is, it's really building an ecosystem and really selling intelligence and no longer point solutions or data or just, specified for a specific vertical. And then the other thing is when you're building the ecosystem, you're selling not just to a particular customer, but you're selling to customer of the customer, partners of the customer, the whole ecosystem, really. So there is whole horizontal tech stack value creation as well in IoT. And if you look at the same graphs as in 2017, you will see applications, which could be mobile and web applications, are having the largest share of the revenue. Connected things, which is primarily hardware, but also it includes the firmware on the hardware, having the second largest share, and then services, which includes professional services and consulting and managed services. You can see communication is important, but as security has been very little, but it has a very high growth, and I would estimate that it will be even higher. And what you're seeing then is really 4 years ago, if I showed these graphs, you would have seen few big names, if any. And now, actually, you see few startups, if any. Of the two, well, the one startup is C3 IoT, which quote unquote has $1.5 billion valuation. They grew 150% bookings last year, 60% revenue. PTC, we already spoke about. It's a manufacturing. It wasn't a small company, but today they have about 100 million sort of revenue in IoT. They did 5 acquisitions to get where they are, and they really have done a good job to use IoT both for their internal operations, but also to create products, especially PLM, product line management around it, and sell it to their customers. But you can see very large players, and this is dominated by cloud providers, but also other, like SAP and others. And so let's talk a little bit about what is emerging technologies and IoT. And I'm seeing that I'm starting to run out of time, so I will pick and choose what I'm talking about now. In terms of artificial intelligence, which is another sector we work on, very importantly, you're getting so much data out of IoT that in order to make sense out of it, you do need AI. Just to give you an idea, for example, for heart attack, if you use AI, it can actually predict a heart attack much better than a doctor can, because through AI you'll be able to figure out a lot of patterns. Drones are heavily used now for insurance and agriculture. Edge computing to mesh computing is quite needed for legacy equipment. We have about $370 billion opportunity there. Blockchain is very interesting. It's the beginning of usage in IoT. One of the areas that is making good progress is IoT and supply chain, i.e. blockchain and IoT for supply chain visibility. And what is interesting is today IoT, majority of time, if not all the time, is a very centralized solution, right? It's still specialized, centralized, and blockchain allows it to become decentralized and provide data and information that you can then share with the different parts of the ecosystem. And of course, cyber identity, that we want to talk a little bit more about it. In general, we think IoT has an identity problem, and you can see it's really trusted information to multiple stakeholders. And it's really a question of how do you do that, and it's not so easy. And we all know, for example, how what in September of 2016, how hackers used a lot of the cameras, routers for IoT, and were able to do the DDoS, which is denial of distribution of service, and brought down large number of websites. So we have a problem as an industry. This is a framework that we have developed, and I'm not going to go through it, it's quite complicated, but basically what it says is identity authentication is a very complex, rapidly expanding and hyper large market, in a sense that hackers are actually making this sector to be quite important. Now, I definitely didn't want to finish this conversation without talking to you about other emerging trends in IoT, not just technical and technology, but more soft ones. So first of all, IoT governance. We're collecting a lot of data. How do we store it? Who has access to it? How do we eliminate it? None of this is being thought through. And governments are way, way behind even thinking about it as usual, as they were like with cybersecurity. Data platforms and brokering, things, e-commerce and payments. These are, how do you do that? That is related also to user experience, and then really trusted hardware and system identity, which we talked. So I wanted to finish my talk by telling you what I think in enterprise world, what are some of the predictions that I would make in 2019, and those are, first, I do think B2B and not B2C is the one which will be driving the growth. I do think that software and cloud giants, as we showed earlier, will push towards single IoT platforms, but I don't think by end of 2019 we will have that all hashed out. But I think we get closer. I think IoT managed services and professional services will grow because on the back of effectively lack of standards and interoperability. So that would be also not resolved in 2019. And I also don't think that we are going to resolve the cybersecurity threat in 2019. So with that note, I leave you with all those good thoughts and finish my talk.
And if you're going to ask it, come up to a microphone, please, like this one or the one over there.
No ringers. Okay. Then I'll ask it. Steve, no? Oh, okay. Can we just talk a little bit more on blockchain? You know, I'm assuming in some of your companies you're using it now. Can you give me an observation as to how trusted you feel the distributed system is going to be and where you see problems occurring?
That one of my companies, I am on board of a bank called Banco Santander. And so in financial services, in fact, we finally have blockchain, and we launched a payment, peer-to-peer payment across 4 of our countries. In terms of, and I'm also on board of a company called Landstar, which is in transportation and logistics. There we're thinking about it, and we're part of an alliance that has like 250 members now in a matter of like months, and it's all around transportation and supply chain. I think it's, so you've seen, forget about the cryptocurrencies, but you've seen that companies like Ripple, so there are sort of platform companies have been created to use blockchain, but blockchain is like, it's open source, as you know. It's just like open source. You need companies to come and give you tools right on top of it, so then you can use it. Otherwise, it's kind of like raw meat. You can't really eat it and digest it. Either you're a big company and you do it yourself, or you try to go with Ripple, or you basically have to have of Red Hat, which made open source digestible by enterprises to create that. And I think we're not quite there.
Excellent. Please give Homaira a round of applause.
Thank you.